Good morning, everyone. This is the voice PowerPoint on the true experimental design. I'm going to share my screen. And let's get started. So when we think about true experimental design, it can actually look a variety of different ways. And it helps to start with sort of the principles of what's the developmental sequence of experimental research, and what's sort of the process that you go through in the state of the science as you work up to that true experimental design, and then follow up with effectiveness and more public policy steps. So this is taken from an article that was done by Robin Whitmore and Margaret Gray, who were from Yale. I believe Margaret's retired now, but they described this process of developing science in an area. And it starts with phase one, where you have basic research that's real exploratory in nature and descriptive. And it's the purpose of the basic science is to establish that there's some kind of relationship between variables, that an intervention may have an effect on some variable. And along with that, you sort of establish what the intervention components should look like, what's the content of that intervention, what's the strength. Do you have to have, if you're doing like a behavioral intervention, does there have to be 20 sessions? Or if you're doing a drug dose, what is the strength of that drug that actually works? The timing of the intervention, and then you also identify the outcomes that you're going to measure for the study. So this is sometimes called bench science or lab science. Sometimes with some studies, it starts with animal studies, but it's your real basic research, trying to establish that something might work. Phase two is then to pilot test that intervention. It's usually a small scale study where you test the intervention with a small number of subjects, and you're really looking at, is this feasible? Could I do a large scale study? Would these outcome measures work? Would people show up for the intervention? And I also identify any alternative strategies. And paying close attention to how you might address potential problems. Phase three then is your efficacy trial. And phase three is usually your randomized controlled trial, which is your true experimental design. So efficacy trials are intended to evaluate an intervention works under the most ideal circumstances. So it's a very controlled setting, and you've controlled for every possible alternative extraneous variable to be controlled for. And we do this by making sure we have a control group and randomly assigning. And so we're going to talk about that. That's the focus of today's voice PowerPoint, is talking about these phase three, the randomized control trial. Then if our intervention works perfectly in the controlled setting where we've controlled for every possible extraneous variable, we want to see, okay, now will it work in the real world? So it's great if it works in my very controlled setting where I've controlled for every possible thing, but can I roll this out in the real world? Will it work on the real clinical unit? Will it work in the real clinical uh, community setting. And you really want to know if it's going to be conducted in clinical practice, will it still be effective? And is it cost effective? So in this stage, you really emphasize external validity and generalizability. Is it going to work in the real world setting? And then phase 5 is what are the effects on public health in which a wide-scale implementation of this intervention takes place, and really looking at public health impact. So those are the phases, and now let's go on and talk about these experimental designs. So this is your phase 3 clinical trial, true experimental design. It's the strongest design for testing cause and effect relationships. And there's 3 essential characteristics of experimental design. First, you have to have random assignment or randomization. Sometimes you can't do random assignment of individuals, so you might randomly assign clinics or randomly assign units. But the trouble with that is you have to make sure that those units are the same, or those clinics are the same, and there aren't alternative characteristics that could be responsible for the differences you're seeing. So you have random assignment, and you have an experimental group that receives some treatment or intervention, and a comparison group or an attention control group, where they get just equal amounts of attention, but they don't really receive the intervention. So as we think about this research process from beginning to end, let's start at the research idea up by the yellow block at the top. So you have some idea of what might work for the problem that you're interested in, and you do a literature review. And you really read all the literature, and you come up with some idea, some theoretical basis for what you think causes that research problem. So let me use childhood obesity as an example here. So if I believe that the reason that we have a problem with childhood obesity is because kids are less physically active, then I believe theoretically that if I change the physical activity component, we'll take care of the childhood obesity problem. And so, so that's the theory that would be behind an intervention that would look at just a physical activity intervention. In reality, as we've done research over the years in childhood obesity, we've come to recognize that it's an eating activity and behavior change components that are needed in order to move the needle on childhood obesity. And so your theoretical formulation needs to include all 3 components, and then your intervention needs to include all 3 components, and then your outcome should include all 3 components. But let's just use physical activity as an example to go around the rest of the wheel. So then your empirical research question is really operationalizing how you're going to measure those things. So you're going to have 2 groups. You're going to randomly assign to get the intervention and not get the intervention. And then you're going to measure the outcome. So if I believe that physical activity is the reason, decreased physical activity is the reason for childhood obesity, and then I give a physical activity intervention, and then I want to measure physical activity as measured by, so a basic thing you could use would be a pedometer. Actigraphy is a more the gold standard, but of course costs money and may not be feasible. But the best, when you're doing a true randomized controlled trial, it's best to use the strongest possible measure. So let's say we're going to do actigraphy. So then you go to research design. And in the research design phase, you really want to think of all the possible alternatives and how you can control for those alternatives. So we know that self-monitoring is something that could change a person's physical activity. So wearing a pedometer and monitoring themselves on how many steps they're getting could potentially have an influence on the physical activity. So that might be an extraneous variable, and that might be another reason why you want to use actigraphy instead, and just do it intermittently and not have the child doing their continuous monitoring. But let's say you plan this research design. Now you've randomized to get the physical activity and not get the physical activity. You've operationalized how you're going to measure it with actigraphy, and it's going to be intermittent. It's not going to be continuous, so you're not going to have problems with self-monitoring. Think about the other things that could influence physical activity. We know, especially as children get older, that boys are far more likely to be active than girls. So that's something you might want to take into consideration in your research design. So as we move through and talk about the different types of randomized controlled trials, we'll talk about a way to control for that. Then you're going to do your data collection, your data analysis. You're going to answer that empirical research question, and then you're going to have theoretical interpretations of the results. Then you go back and compare with earlier research. And so you might say, wow, we found something similar to, for example, Margaret Gray did some work in this area with kids with type 2 diabetes. So we found something similar to Margaret, but we also found some things different than that group. So those are the things that you want to think about. You come to your conclusions, and then from that should be generated a new research idea. What's the next step that needs to be addressed in this program of research? So that's the process. Now let's talk about some examples of true experimental design. So the most basic is the two-group randomized control trial with a pre-post test design. So the R stands for random assignment. You're randomly assigned to either get treatment 1 or treatment 2, and the X's stand for your treatment. So 1 being experimental, 2 being control. And then the O's stand for outcome measures, the first outcome measure and the second outcome measure. So they're randomized. You get a baseline, then you give them the treatment and or control condition, and then you measure outcomes again and see if there are differences between groups and between pre to post. And that's your most basic RCT. And I'm not sure if it's cutting off part of my cartoon here, but there's 2 scientists in the lab, and the one scientist says, there's a flaw in your experimental design. All the mice are Scorpios. So having differences between groups on baseline variables suggests there's a problem with randomization. So as you read these RCTs, you should be looking for how did they determine the sample size they needed, and did they look at baseline differences between the groups? Because if there are differences, if they had a large enough sample and they randomized, it should take care of these baseline variables being pretty consistent. If they're not, then you can do a different type of analysis, and we'll talk about that later. But at this point, these are things you want to critique your true experimental design research for. Did they determine sample size ahead of time? And did they report whether or not these samples were pretty similar before they did the intervention? So here's another type of true experimental design, and this is the true two-group RCT with repeated measures follow-up. This particular design is particularly strong for quality improvement type projects. So you have two groups, you randomize them to get the treatment or be the control group or the reference group, and you follow them for a period of time after the intervention. And what typically happens with interventions is people are kind of motivated and they do really well post-intervention, but then the power of the intervention kind of washes out over time, and you'll have what we call a regression toward the mean again, you know, a return to old behavior. This is good to know for quality improvement, right? Because what you're after is achieving continuous improvement, not a regression toward back to where they were. So this is a particularly strong design for those kinds of studies and that kind of work. So another type is the two-group RCT with a post-test only design. This might be used when we think the observation, the outcome measure, might have an influence on the participant. So education tests, we know that sometimes taking multiple choice exams helps a student pass their certification exam. And so if we gave a baseline test and then did an education program and then did a follow-up test, was it our education or was it the fact that they've already taken a similar test and they're more used to thinking about multiple choice test questions? So this would allow you to look at the effects of the education on two groups and what the performance was on that test after the education without the influence of the testing effect. Another example of this is when a baseline measure isn't possible. So you may have a time where you can't do the baseline measure and you just have to do it post-intervention. As long as you have randomization, as long as you have treatment and control, and as long as you have the measure of the intervention, it's still considered an RCT. This one is a true group randomized control trial without an intention control. So this might be somebody who doesn't have any kind of attention control. It's just a comparison group and you do the measures. This is a little more cost effective because you don't have to spend time doing the control intervention. But most people are now considering this a little weaker design because we can't answer the question, was it the attention alone or was it the specific intervention that caused the change in the outcomes? Then there's another type where you use three groups and you include all of those. So you give intervention one, you give the control, and then you give nothing, and you look at the outcomes in all three groups. And this allows you to answer two questions. Was it the intervention that caused a difference, or was it attention alone that caused the difference? Then you can get more complicated and do the Solomon 4 group. And it just adds a fourth group where you have observation or baseline measure before your treatment and before your control. And then you have a treatment and a control that don't get a baseline measure, and you measure everybody at the end. And again, that allows you to answer that question, Was it the intervention itself that caused the difference? Was it the attention from being in the control group, or was it the differences between the intervention and the control? There's also the 2x2 factorial design. And if we were doing education and an exercise intervention, and we wanted to know, was the education alone effective? Was the exercise alone effective? We could do this 2x2 design. There's also a 3-way factorial design where it gets just a little more complicated, and it might be location, intensity, and frequency. So it might be you do a variety of locations, doing it at the clinic, doing it at the school, and doing it at the rec center. And then the intensity, once a week, twice a week, every day. And then that would be frequency, sorry. And intensity would be an hour or half hour. And you could look at the variety of variables and how they impact your outcomes. You can also do a crossover design, and that's where you only have, you decide that you have these 2 groups and you do baseline on both. One gets the treatment, one gets the control, and then you do your outcome measures. Then you have a washout period of whatever amount of time, and then you do another baseline on both groups, but the opposite group gets the treatment, and then you do outcome measures. And this example is looking at feeding and fasting and changing, having everybody in both groups get both, but the timing of when they get them is opposite. So as we're thinking about this efficacy and effectiveness, remember that was our phase 3 and phase 4 differences in that developmental trajectory of science. Remember that efficacy is what is the benefit of this intervention compared to a control or a standard program under the most controlled setting. So I've controlled for every alternative possibility. And then effectiveness, or what are the benefits of the use of this intervention or procedure in real world situation. So the block design is one where, remember when we were talking about the circle and how things evolved. And the block design is used if you think there are variables that might explain differences that you really want to build into your design. So we were talking about the example of physical activity by gender. We know boys, especially by the time they're in adolescence, are more physically active than girls. So what we would do here is have block 1 for boys and block 2 for girls. And then all the boys would be randomly assigned to either get the treatment or the control, and all the girls would be randomly assigned to get treatment and control. And then you'd compare the results. So this one's an example of gender, the blocking variable being male and female again, and dose. So we know there may be differences in male and female response to different drugs, and lower doses may work for different genders. So this is where you would have 3-group design, 0.5 milligram, 1.5, and 3 milligram, and you would give them to males and females so that you could answer that question, what's the best dose? And is there a difference between males and females in dose response? Another little bit more complicated design is a nested design, but remember we talked about sometimes it's not possible to randomize by individual, and so you randomize by clinic. And when you randomize by clinic, that's a nested design. So what we did in one of our studies was have 24 school-based health centers across 6 states, and we wanted to include both rural and urban. And so you, again, have the individuals nested by site, but the sites were randomly assigned to get the intervention or the control. So it's just another type of randomized control trial. You also can do a one-way repeated measures design. And this one, you will see that you have study participants, and then people are randomized to get the intervention or the control, and then have the outcome measures, and then get intervention 2 and intervention 3, and then the outcome measures, intervention 3 and intervention 1. So you alternate who's getting what in what order, and this allows you to also have a randomized control trial. So as you think about this content, I'd like you to just think about a few examples of a true experimental design that would be of interest in your area that you are exploring, either for your quality improvement project or for your dissertation. And just sketch out the study design. Would it be feasible? What would the data collection procedures look like? How would it happen in the real world? Just to stretch your brain to think about applying this content to something that matters to you personally. It was fun sharing some time with you today, and I look forward to seeing your critiques of the true experimental design.